Hi, welcome. My name's Christine Kelly, and this is Kirsten Gianco. Both of us are teachers in the Archdiocese of Boston. I teach first grade, and Kirsten teaches middle school. This is a presentation on a rationale for a needs-based fairness curriculum, and it's the impact on an inclusive classroom. So throughout this session, we want you to walk away with an understanding of needs-based fairness and how it impacts students in specifically Catholic classrooms. We'll begin by looking at the evolution of inclusion in Catholic schools and how we can create more inclusive, positive classroom cultures. We're proposing that grounded in research and our own practice, teaching a needs-based fairness curriculum will do exactly that. So if we look at what the church says about inclusion and about the other, it's very clear in Catholic social teaching and in all of these church leaders that for people who are able to walk out to the margins to create solidarity and to create a more inclusive community. We see this in Catholic social teaching, how each person is sacred, each person is social, each person has rights and responsibilities. We are called to care for the poor and vulnerable. Students who have disabilities being the vulnerable here in this circumstance. Father Pedro Rupe has a pretty notable quote that says, "Education aims to create fully human people who are passionate about the welfare of others and eager to transform the world." That's what every teacher looks for out of their students. They want them to contribute positively to the world, to make people feel good, to be, a follower of God, a disciple themselves. So the evolution of Catholic education is really interesting because, way back when Catholic schools started, it was this immigrant church. Our church is grounded in diversity. It was a support system for immigrants. Catholic schools were for poor and marginalized youth. However, there was kind of always historically this underrepresentation of students with disabilities. And there has been this conversation throughout about resources and how, oh, we don't have the resources to support students with disabilities. We aren't able to support that student. And a lot of times that's used as a little bit of a scapegoat. And even in my own experience, at my ripe age of 25, I have experienced that conversation and that, okay, does our school have the resources to support this specific student with this specific disability? Do we have the supports? And it is an important conversation, but I think that it's really important to look at it critically, because it can be used as an excuse in a way. So Catholic schools have historically referred students to public schools, referred students with disabilities to public schools. So there's this friction of the history of inclusion in Catholic schools and what the church actually teaches. And as a teacher, you feel that pull as well. You feel that tension. And there has been very little research around curriculums that foster an inclusive environment in Catholic schools specifically. So we decided to do something about it. And we wanted to create a curriculum that addresses needs-based fairness in the classroom with students. And we wanted to see the effect that it had on our classroom culture, on our students with disabilities, but also on our students who function typically.
And so this curriculum was grounded in some theory around needs-based fairness. Before we dive into that, we are going to ask that you reframe your idea of equality for this presentation. Equality is something that we all strive and work and advocate for on a daily basis. But when it comes to fairness and how it is used in the literature, we are thinking about equality in the manner that this photo shows, that everyone is getting the same exact thing, that it is equal. Meanwhile, on a very basic level, needs-based fairness is everyone getting what they need. So one member on this image needs 2 boxes, the other one needs 1, and one needs none to be able to see the game. And needs-based fairness is calling into question how many boxes we are giving people based on what they need. When we are able to be successful with needs-based fairness, that results in an equitable education. So just keep this image in your mind as we go through some of the theory and framework that we grounded the curriculum in. So the fairness types in more detail is there's equality fairness, which is everyone receiving the same support. An example is every student is going to get access to an audiobook, that regardless if you are a high reader, a low reader, if you are someone that needs supports or doesn't need support, you are getting access to an audiobook and while we're reading a class text. If we go to the right side and we look at equity fairness, this is thinking about support proportionate to input. So if I work really hard, then I'm going to be able to use an audiobook. Needs-based fairness is this middle ground in what research and we believe leads to an equitable education, and it is everyone getting the supports that they need. So a great example is a student with dyslexia getting access to an audiobook. She will obviously also get other supports that she needs in regards to services, but within the classroom, the support that her peers or his peers will most likely see is this audiobook. That is, they're holding a text, their peer has an audiobook. And that, if that is happening in a classroom, that is because that teacher is engaging in needs-based fairness. What we're going to talk about is how do you address the perceptions that might come from the peers that are noticing the audiobook with this one student. So thinking about those perceptions, we dived into the research around attitude formation, thinking about how students form their attitudes about disabilities and about scaffolds and supports like that audiobook that we just mentioned. So there are three different categories of attitude formation. There's cognitive, which is just the awareness that disabilities exist and understanding what that means. There's affective, which is how do we emotionally react? Do we react with empathy? Do we react with sympathy? Do we react with jealousy? There is then behavioral, which is how do we take what we know and how we're feeling and then act. So we are going to dive into the impact of taking this, these theories and frames and putting it into a curriculum that was done in a school setting.
Awesome. So now we have kind of the grounded in theory, we're moving toward the practical. So the school context here, the school that the study was done in was an urban Catholic school founded in 2007. So we're looking at the implementation of first and third grade classrooms in this particular school. And historically, so this school was 3 separate Catholic schools that were on the verge of closing. And so they had merged into one that created the school in which our study was. They currently serve 180 students preschool to third grade. So there are 2 campuses. There is a preschool to third grade campus and then a 4th to 8th grade campus. They're 2 separate buildings, probably 7 minutes away from each other. It is the only Catholic elementary school in that particular city. And yeah. So if we look at these are the students in the lower campus, the preschool to third grade, or in each of these classes, I'm sorry, in these first and third grade classes. So this is the religious denominations and the student race denominations. So it is a predominantly students of color. So in the first grade classroom, there were 14 students, 8 girls and 6 boys. In the third grade classroom, we were working with 16 students, 8 boys and 8 girls. A lot of these students were linguistically diverse. We have 6 students in first grade who spoke Haitian Creole in addition to English, 2 students that spoke Portuguese in addition to English, 1 Spanish, and then 6 native English speakers. In third grade, you'll look at similar numbers, 5 with Haitian Creole, 1 Vietnamese, 1 Filipino, 1 Swahili Luo, 1 Spanish, and 6 native English. All right, so language is a really important piece of this curriculum, and we wanted student accessible language that they felt comfortable using and that they were able to kind of have a framework of how to discuss these issues of fairness that are happening in their lives and in the classroom. So we decided our three very specific, very big terms in this curriculum were fair, struggle, and tool. And you have them defined on this image. So fair means that everyone gets the tools that they need. Again, flipping this idea of equality on its head. Um, so we were teaching students to kind of break down this idea that, oh, it's fair if I have a blue bow and she has a blue bow. However, we challenged them on that and said, fair is everyone gets the tools that they need, right? If my hair is not in my face, I don't need a blue bow. So our struggle is something that is hard or challenging. We talk about how everyone has struggles. Absolutely everyone in the world has struggles. No one is good at everything. And how, so and so might struggle with math, but then another person might struggle with reading. And our struggles are relative to our strengths as well. Where we have struggles, we also have strengths, and that's something to celebrate. And a tool is a way that we solve or combat a struggle. So, for example, a student is struggling to sit still in the classroom. We might use a wobbly stool as a tool. And you'll hear students using that language as the curriculum progresses. They'll say, they'll raise their hand, I'm feeling really wiggly. Can I use the tool of a wobble stool? And they'll be able to recognize their own need. And then it really helps with the attitude formation, as you'll see as we continue. So there's a first grade curriculum and a third grade curriculum, and there are similarities between, obviously, a large crossover between the two grades. We just took it a step further for third grade. So as you'll see, in week 1, we address the cognitive first. So we talk about those definitions of fairness, struggle, and tool. And we do some simulations of different disabilities. So they learn about blindness, they learn about different disabilities that people have and how people function differently. And they will come to realize that it's not a negative thing necessarily, that these are just different ways people function and they have different tools in order to live their lives in a way that works for them. Week 2, we'll continue talking about cognitive, and we talk about physical struggles and tools. There's a sweet little short film that we play that has a little boy with a dog that only has one leg. The dog only has one leg, and the little boy also happens to only have one leg. And the beginning of the video, really dislikes the dog, but then he comes to find this camaraderie with the dog, and they develop a relationship as they go. And the kids will talk about how, the little boy uses crutches as a tool. He used the dog as a tool to help his mood. And so it's really, really fun to see students kind of watch something like that and then start identifying some of the frameworks that we work on. Week 3 is effective. So now we're starting to move into this attitude change and this emotional change. So we talk about every student has emotional struggles and needs different tools for that, especially when they're young, first grade specifically. Somebody might be really upset because they took their marker or whatever it may be. There are emotional struggles, and we talk about within their family and within school what some of those emotional struggles are. We ask them to identify in their own lives and in their own classrooms. And then we talk about different tools and scaffolds that might be helpful. So, is it a cool down corner? Is it some sort of fidget? Things like that. And they use sentence stems to say, I struggled when I felt blank. The tool I used was blank. And lastly, we move through to behavioral. So this is kind of this application, this culminating activity. We have a fairness jar in the classroom. And so students are able to write anonymously when they are feeling like something is unfair at school or at home for that matter. So we have some examples of what that looks like. I believe it's so cognitive lessons. This is some images from there, some stories that we read. And in the bottom right picture, they're doing a blindness simulation. So one student, pre-COVID, of course, one student is helping another student to trace out a letter with Play-Doh, and that was Play-Doh was one of the tools that they used, um, because we set a letter in front of them and we said, "Okay, read the letter," and they were blindfolded and they were like, "Well, we can't." So we used Play-Doh as a tool and they tried to trace the letter with Play-Doh, and one student took another student's hand to trace it and they said, "Oh, I feel it. I think it's this. I think it's that." So it was really fun to kind of see them and how their attitude changed immediately when they were given that tool.
And then I want to add on to that we made the jump from the Play-Doh to the Braille.
Yeah,
And so over here on the left is a collection of books about fairness, but also some books that have Braille on them and the text underneath. So we were able to make this jump from the Play-Doh to people that are blind are able to read just as we are using a different tool.
exactly. Awesome. Thank you for adding that.
And then, so in third grade, these are some of the responses. So those were pictures from first grade. These are responses from third. And you'll notice in these responses that they are saying things like, I think fairness is when you get the tools that you need to do or heal something. I think fairness is like getting what you need, like helping you with your struggle, but not every person has the same struggle. So we all needed different things. These are students being able to conceptualize what the definition of fairness is using the language that had been provided.
So now we jump into the affective, the emotional lessons here. So these are some different stories that we read. This is The Way I Feel. I'm sure most of you have heard of it. And then this book is called Not So Different. It's by a man named Shane Bierkraw, and he has a very specific disability. And he talks about, how do you brush your hair? And these are kind of, it's framed as kids asking him these questions. And so, um, the kids were able to read it and almost relate to it in a way. They would say like, "Oh, like I have to use my mom to help me make dinner because I can't make dinner by myself." Things like that. When he goes through and talks about his daily life. So it was really nice to get to see students connecting and showing some empathy for a person with disabilities, but also finding some commonalities and being able to kind of see themselves like, oh, what if I was in a wheelchair? What if I couldn't use my legs or my arms? How would that change my life? What tools would I need in order to be able to continue with my daily activities? In this last picture, you'll see this was during Catholic Schools Week, but I don't know if you noticed right at the top, they have the little poster of struggles and tools. And that was something I think in this picture, the student is asking for a tool and the teacher being the tool. So awesome.
And then when we look at the third grade, these were those sentence stems that Christine had mentioned earlier. So the third graders were answering of, I felt mad because I didn't get what I want. The tool I used was a stress ball. Now I feel better. So this is a classroom contained example, but the next one is one where they're starting to apply it to their exterior life outside of school. So this student said, I felt angry because I didn't get enough sleep because my brother kept annoying me. I had a headache. The tool I used was to sleep in the car, not thinking about anything. Now I feel great. So again, making that connection between the lessons that we are learning in school about struggles and tools and fairness is applied to our lives outside of the classroom as well as inside. So we are really living the gospel and living the life of making sure that we are thinking about fairness and tools and struggles to have those effective attitude formations go past the classroom. Something we realized as we were developing this curriculum is that we not only want it to transfer outside of the classroom, but we also want it to become part of the classroom's inner fabric. So really making it a part of the longevity of classroom norms, rather than isolated within the 4 weeks of the curriculum. So to do that, we created a fairness jar. And as you can see here, this is one example of the fairness jar. And there are some specific rules that we had taken from different literature and the research that we have read. And one of the biggest things was that it needed to be anonymous. Another thing was that it needed to have a procedure. So our procedure with the students was to have them, if they were feeling like something was unfair, they could ask to use the fair jar to write down what had happened. So you'll see, for example, there's a slip of paper that says, "I think it's unfair that my sister has more help." This is one example of a student putting in an instance where they felt that something was unfair. Then the classroom would come together as a community, and as part of our morning meeting or our closing circle, we would take a piece of paper out of the fair jar and we would talk about it. So we would be practicing these skills outside of the curriculum and identifying what is the struggle. So the struggle here is that the sister is getting more help. Contextually, the sister had a tutor. So this student is upset that their sibling has a tutor and they do not. So we identified this as a group and we said, is that fair? Is that something that that student needs? Does the student need a tutor? And the students talked, and there's this this productive cognitive struggle that goes on when you have to talk about a personal or real situation comparative to a more abstract or distant example. So they had decided that it was fair for the sister, but this specific scholar ended up they made the decision to say who they were. And they said that they felt that it was unfair because they were struggling in math. So then the classroom had decided that the tool could be that this student was had some extra math time with the teacher. And then they decided that it was fair that the sister had a tutor because the student was getting the tool that they needed. And it wasn't the reading tutor that the sister had. So we are going to give you a few moments to go through this process yourself. So is this fair? This is a student example. And the student said, at music, everyone makes noise at music, so it gives me a headache, if that's how you spell it. Is that fair? And so we would like you to pause the video and answer these questions. What is the student's struggle? What tool could help them? If we use this tool, does everyone have what they need? So pause the video and answer those 3 questions, please, and then we'll discuss it. So this is what happened in the classroom when this problem or struggle was brought up. So the students had identified that the struggle was that a student was getting a headache because of the noise at music. They had a conversation about whether or not that was unfair, because in music class it is noisy. They're using instruments, and that is a tool that people need to make music. So they then talked about what was a tool for this student. And they decided that the tool could be that this student could go for a walk to get a drink of water, and that this student could talk to the teacher about potentially having them have a unit on a quieter instrument. They had talked about humming and body percussion. And they had decided if we use these 2 tools, then everyone has what they need. We're able to learn the music skills. We're able to get a drink of water. We're able to maybe still participate in music, but participate in music lessons that are at a lower octave than the ones that were currently being played. So this is one example of what would happen in the 1st and the 3rd grade classroom when students would have an opportunity to continue these skills throughout the school year.
So as we move into kind of these differences between the first and third grade curriculum, we'll continue to have, those first 2 weeks, cognitive and affective, same situations with the simulations and sentence stems and asking students to identify struggles and tools. Um, However, we see these differences bolded in blue on week 4. We take another week of effective change with third graders, and they start to kind of connect to this idea of advocacy and what is an advocate and what does it mean to advocate for someone. And we connected this because a lot of times not only are there tangible tools that you can hold like a stress ball, but also you can use teachers as a tool. You can use parents as a tool. And we talk about people as tools. So they decided that we decided that we were going to read the story of Zacchaeus. The story is that Zacchaeus is in the tree, and he's a tax collector. He's a short man, so he climbs up to the tree to see Jesus speaking amongst this group of people. And he says, Zacchaeus, come down from the tree. And Zacchaeus comes down, and he everybody in the town hates Zacchaeus because he's a tax collector. He stole money from them. We explain this to the students. We talk about the context of how would you feel if you were somebody that Zacchaeus was collecting money from? How would you feel if you were one of the people in the crowd and Jesus picks him out of everyone when he's this horrible man who steals and lies? I talk about effectively, how would they feel? But then we talk about Jesus pulled him aside and Jesus had a conversation with him and Jesus asked to stay at his house. And how Zacchaeus had this effective change. He had this kind of coming to Jesus, haha, that he was not going to do that anymore. He was going to return the money. He was going to be a true and honest man. He was going to walk in the steps of Jesus. And how Jesus really was an advocate for Zacchaeus. The people strongly disliked him. And Jesus said, no, 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 I'm going to stand up for him. And I see the good in him. I want to push him and challenge him to be better. And that's what Jesus did. And that's what our students can do for one another. And I think one of the most notable changes within a classroom culture after this curriculum is that students will challenge and support one another. A student will look over and see another student struggling and use that language and say, hey, I see that you're really struggling to finish that math problem. Do you need a tool? I can be your tool. I can help you. Or, I can get the teacher. She can be your tool and help you. So it was really amazing, especially in third grade, to see them advocate for each other in that way. Um, and when we made this move to behavioral, we had students, put it to action and put it in words, and they wrote these prayers, and how prayer is advocating for another person, how we can pray for a group of people or for a specific person, how God can be an advocate for us and can be kind of a tool, a source of comfort. And so these are what the students said. Prayer is advocating because you're praying for someone who doesn't have what they need. They're referring to these tools. They don't have what they need. Dear God, I pray to you today because I do not think it is fair that kids don't get to go to school. Please build a good path for them. Amen. I believe during this time they were speaking about Malala and some of the issues with her and how she couldn't go to school and things like that. So I think that's where that came from.
And so we, not only as teachers, are seeing this change, but we wanted to include a principal testimony. So this is after the principal had come in and saw one of these lessons in action. And this was to that teacher. And the principal said, your dedication to equity in the classroom is woven into your daily instruction. It's important for us to note that equity does not necessarily mean equality. Your students all receive the supports they need, even though they're all different. And it's impressive that students are able to excel accept and acknowledge that instead of wanting the things they see their classmates getting, they are getting what they need. The conversations your students engage in around differences are nothing short of inspiring. So this is just an external testimony to what was happening in the classrooms when this curriculum was being implemented. And so we want to give you the tools to be able to implement this in your own school communities. So we have a site that I am going to share and show some of the pieces of it. But before we do that, we do want to acknowledge some questions that we still have. So thinking about COVID, how does COVID impact the supports and scaffolds that scholars perceive? Because the transition back to in-person learning is going to have a range of student needs, we're thinking about what, we know that there's going to be a higher need for a needs-based fairness curriculum, but what are the contents of that going to be? Because it's probably going to be more than a stress ball. It's probably going to be more than an audiobook. We as teachers are going to have to go back to the drawing board in some respects to think about how to best support the scholars that are the most vulnerable. Thinking about how can we facilitate an explicit conversation about current systems that inhibit needs-based fairness. Our curriculum does not go into systemic injustices, and that is something that we are grappling with now of how do we push this to the next level. And thinking about that, also, when does equality count as needs-based fairness? When is it that everyone does need the same thing? Everyone needs to be able to vote. Right? So how do we explain that to students so that it's then not flipped on its head that everybody needs that blue ribbon that Christina talked about in the beginning? There also was an alarming lack of representation in picture books that are of students with disabilities. So that was one thing that we struggled with because we serve students of diverse backgrounds and want to make sure that we are providing representation and texts that are mirrors when it comes to representation and windows when it comes to abilities and ways of seeing the world. So we also are trying to think about how to balance the minority representation with the general underrepresentation of minority groups amongst picture books. We also want to move to teaching advocacy to first grade and thinking about stories that would be factual enough without as much of a heavy dependence as the third grade story needs with inferencing, and thinking about how to move forward with the first grade curriculum with that. So all of that being said, we wanted to show this site. So this is an active link that you can put into your computer. And when you do, it will bring you to this page here. It has a short blurb of kind of our rationale for why this is important and what we had talked about at the beginning of this presentation. You'll see a student example identifying a struggle and a tool. You'll also see a link to the presentations that we currently went over. And you'll also see both of our emails at the bottom that when you click on it will bring you to Gmail. But what we wanted to make sure that we pointed out was that we have a not necessarily the full curriculum in regards to the details, but we have an overview to share. So this is the grade 1 handout, and you'll see that it has each lesson broken down by the type of attitude formation we were working on. And it has the objective, instructional activities, and the exit ticket. So here's that video that Christine was talking about earlier. And it's just a way to guide you into implementing it in your own context and to show some of the resources and questions that we were asking when we were thinking about how do we teach the language of fairness and struggle and tool to students. And the last is our works cited, some of the literature that we pulled from in creating this curriculum. And we really hope that this has been an informative session and that you all got what you needed out of this session. But if you did not, please feel free to reach out to us. Or if you have answers to some of those questions that we are currently grappling with, we would love to communicate with you about them.
Thank you.